I repair internet cables in the deep ocean. Something lives down there. 11 years I had been doing fault repairs on subsea telecommunications cables. 11 years of pulling failed sections up from the bottom of the Atlantic, splicing them, resealing them, lowering them back down, and moving on to the next fault. Most people did not know the cables existed. They used the internet every day, transferred money across continents, made calls that bounced through satellites they thought were carrying the signal, and had no idea that 95% of all international data traveled not through the sky, but through cables lying on the ocean floor, cables no thicker than a garden hose in the shallow sections, and not much thicker in the deep, cables that ran for thousands of kilometers across terrain that made the surface of the moon look hospitable, cables that were damaged constantly by fishing trawls and ship anchors and submarine landslides and the slow crushing weight of geological movement, cables that someone had to go fix. I was one of those people. I worked for Atlantic Subsea Maintenance, a cable repair company contracted by the consortium of telecommunications firms that owned the North Atlantic cable infrastructure. I had been on 11 different repair vessels over my career, each one a specialized ship with a cable engine and a jointing bay and an ROV suite, and a crew of 30 to 40 people who existed for the single purpose of finding damaged cable sections, raising them to the surface, fixing them, and returning them to the bottom. I had completed 89 repair operations over 11 years, faults in 400 meters of water and faults in 4,800 meters, faults caused by trawl net entanglement and faults caused by submarine earthquakes, faults in cable sections laid in 1988, and faults in cable sections laid last year. I had seen every kind of damage that the ocean and human activity could inflict on a cable, and I had fixed all of it. I had developed, over 11 years, an eye for damage. The way a doctor develops a clinical intuition for what healthy tissue looks like and what damaged tissue looks like. I had developed an intuition for what cable damage looked like depending on its cause. Trawl net damage had a specific profile. Compression damage from the weight of the net. Abrasion marks from the mesh. Sometimes the cable itself bent at the point of entanglement in a way that told you exactly how the net had run over it. Anchor damage was more violent, shearing damage. Sometimes complete severance, always at a shallow angle consistent with a dragging chain. Geological damage from substrate movement had a different character. The cable pinched or kinked along the line of the fault plane. The armor wires showing stress patterns consistent with lateral force. Biological damage was rarer. Shark bites on shallow sections. Something that looked like bite marks from large beaked creatures on middle depth sections. Evidence of boring organisms on sections that had been sitting undisturbed for decades. I knew the signatures. I knew how to read a cable the way a forensic examiner reads a body. The damage telling a story about what had happened, when, and from what direction. I am telling you this because on June 3rd of last year, when we raised the damaged section of cable TN4 from 3,200 meters depth in the mid-Atlantic, I looked at the damage profile and I could not read it. I could not identify the cause. I had looked at 89 repair sections over 11 years, and I had never once failed to identify a probable cause. This was the first time, and it was not the last. The RSS Meridian was the repair vessel I had been assigned to for 3 years when the TN4 fault occurred. She was a cable ship, 120 meters long, 8,500 tons displacement, purpose-built for cable repair operations with a bow sheave and cable engine capable of handling cable at depths to 6,000 meters. A Class 3 dynamic positioning system that could hold station within 2 meters in all but the worst sea states. And an ROV suite that was better equipped than most research vessels I had been on. The vessel's cable engineer was a man named Rob Ferreira, 48 years old, from the Azores, who had been repairing cables for longer than I had, and who had the deliberate and unhurried manner of a person who had learned that depth operations rewarded patience above everything else. Rob had opinions about cables the way other people had opinions about art. He could look at a cross-section of recovered cable and tell you the manufacturer, the approximate installation year, the depth profile it had been laid at, and how long it had been in the water, all without documentation. He was the person I went to when I needed someone to look at a damage profile and confirm what I was seeing. Our ROV pilot was a woman named Soraya Ito, 35 years old, from Sao Paulo, who had started her career on oil and gas survey vessels and come to cable repair because, she said, the work was cleaner. She piloted the ROV with a precision that cable repair demanded, and that not everyone who sat in the pilot's seat possessed. Cable repair ROV work was different from survey ROV work. Survey pilots flew their machines and looked. Repair pilots flew their machines and handled, and handling at 3,000 meters required a feel for the system that most pilots took years to develop. Soraya had it naturally. The vessel captain was Norman Blake, 55 years old, from Aberdeen, who had been on cable ships for 28 years and who communicated primarily through logbook entries and raised eyebrows. He kept a meticulous ship's log that he updated hourly during operations, and that contained, over the course of the events I am going to describe, a record more complete and more precise than anything I could have produced from memory alone. He gave me a copy when I left the vessel in September. I have it beside me as I write this. These were the people who were present for what I am going to tell you. I want you to know their names because they were good at their jobs, and they saw what I saw, and they documented it the same way I documented it. And the documentation did not change what was decided by the people who received it. And I want you to know that the people who saw it were not the kind of people who saw things that weren't there. The TN4 cable fault was reported by the cable owner's monitoring system on June 1st, a signal degradation event indicating physical damage to the cable at a position 1,200 kilometers east of Bermuda and 3,200 meters deep. The Meridian was 3 days transit from the position, and we arrived on June 4th. Standard recovery operation. The grapnel was deployed, the cable located and raised. The damaged section brought aboard the jointing bay. I was in the jointing bay when they laid out the recovered section. 30 meters of cable hauled up for inspection before the repair work began. I looked at it and I stopped. The outer armor wires showed damage. That was normal. Damage was why we were there. What was not normal was the pattern. Armor wire damage from mechanical causes, from trawl nets, anchors, substrate movement. It had directionality. The force that caused the damage came from a specific direction, and the damage profile reflected that. Compression on one side, tension on the other, abrasion on the side of contact. The TN4 damage had no directionality. The armor wires along a 60-centimeter section of the cable were deformed inward, all of them, uniformly, as if the cable had been subjected to even compressive force from all directions simultaneously, as if something had gripped it. not a geological grip, not the slow, uniform pressure of sediment burial. Something had gripped this cable in a specific location and pressed the armor wires inward with a force sufficient to compromise the inner sheath and interrupt the optical fiber bundle inside. The deformation was too uniform for mechanical damage, too localized for geological pressure, too clean for biological predation. There were no tooth marks, no scoring, no tearing. The cable had been squeezed. I called Rob over. He looked at it for a long time. He picked up a section of the deformed armor wire with his gloved hand and flexed it, and looked at the stress profile in the metal. He said the force had been applied inward from all sides simultaneously, not sequentially, not in passes, all sides at once. He said the deformation depth was consistent with a gripping force of approximately 2 to 3 metric tons applied over the 60-centimeter section. He said he did not know what had produced that damage profile. I said neither did I. He said we should photograph everything before the repair. And I said yes, and we did. We repaired the cable, spliced a new section, returned it to the bottom. We filed the damage report with the standard form that asked for probable cause. I wrote unknown, mechanical origin unclear. The operations coordinator in London who received the form called me and asked me to clarify. I told him I could not clarify further. He said the form needed a probable cause entry for the database. I said the probable cause was unknown. He said that was not a category the form accepted. I said the options on the form did not cover what I had found, and I could not select one of them in good conscience. He said he would put trawl net damage as a provisional entry pending further information. I said he could do that and it would be inaccurate. He put trawl net damage. I went back to the jointing bay and looked at my photographs for a long time. The second fault was on July 17th. A different cable, designation TA-11, running from the UK to the eastern seaboard of the United States. 2,800 meters depth, 900 kilometers southeast of the Newfoundland coast. We raised the section and brought it aboard, and I looked at it and felt the same stillness I had felt in the jointing bay on June 4th. The damage profile was identical to TN4. Armor wires deformed inward uniformly over a 60-centimeter section, no directionality, no mechanical signature, no biological predation marks. I photographed everything and called Rob, and he stood over the section for a long time and said nothing, and then said, "Same as June." I said yes. He said, 2 cables, 300 kilometers apart, same damage profile. I said yes. He said that was not a coincidence. I said no, it was not. I went to Captain Blake. I showed him the photographs from both faults, June and July, side by side. He looked at them with the expression he used for logbook entries. Careful and neutral and not yet committed to a conclusion. He asked if I had a theory. I told him I had 2 observations. First, the damage profile was inconsistent with every known cause of subsea cable damage in my experience and Rob's experience. Second, the damage was identical across 2 different cables 300 kilometers apart, which meant whatever had caused it was capable of moving across 300 kilometers of deep ocean between June 1st and July 17th. He said 46 days between faults. I said yes. He said same depth range, 2,800 to 3,200 meters. I said yes. He said he was going to make a logbook entry, and he wanted my damage assessment on paper before we returned to port. He said a written assessment from the lead repair specialist was the kind of documentation that protected everyone when things got complicated later. I asked him if he thought things would get complicated later. He looked at me with the expression he also used for logbook entries and said he thought it was possible. I wrote the assessment that afternoon. 2 pages, single-spaced, describing both damage profiles and technical terms, the measurements of deformation, the force calculations, the absence of any match in my experience or in the published damage literature I had access to. I described the geographic and temporal relationship between the 2 faults. I did not speculate about cause in the written assessment. I described what I had found, and I noted that the cause was unknown, and that the identical profile across 2 separate cables was inconsistent with coincidental damage. I submitted it to the operations coordinator with the July fault documentation. He called me again. He said the form still needed a probable cause entry. I said I understood that. I said I had submitted a written assessment that explained why I could not provide one. He said he would review it and get back to me. He put trawl net damage on the form again. I kept my own copy of the assessment. The 3rd fault happened on August 8th. Cable designation AT7. Same route the Bermuda survey had covered in my reading. Different section, 3,600 meters depth, 1,100 kilometers east of the Florida coast. Same damage profile. 62 centimeters this time, slightly longer than the previous 2. Same inward uniform deformation. Same gripping force calculation. I photographed everything. I called Rob. He looked at the section and then he looked at me and said, "Nothing for a long time." Then he said, "It's getting longer." I said I had noticed. He said the 60 centimeter sections on TN4 and TA11 and now 62 on AT7. I said yes. He said what he thought it meant and I thought the same thing. And neither of us said it out loud in the jointing bay because it was the jointing bay and there were other crew present. We said it later in the officers' mess with Captain Blake. After the rest of the crew had finished eating, Rob said it first. He said the section length was increasing, which was consistent with either a larger contact area or a stronger grip or both. And if the damage was being caused by something biological, a living organism, the increasing section length suggested growth, Blake wrote in his logbook. He wrote it down the way he wrote everything, without the words suggesting growth, but with the measurement data from all 3 faults in sequence, and the notation that the deformation section length had increased from 60 to 62 centimeters, and that the cause remained unknown. I asked him if he was going to report the 3 faults as a pattern to the operations director. He said he was going to report the fault data accurately, and the interpretation was the operations director's to make. He said that was his job. I said I understood. The operations director was a man named George Cullen, based in London, who had been in the cable repair industry for 20 years and who managed the North Atlantic repair fleet with an efficiency that the insurance and liability departments appreciated and that occasionally conflicted with what the people on the water believed needed to be said. Cullen received the August fault report and the written damage assessment I submitted with it, which was now 3 pages and included a comparative table of all 3 fault profiles. He called me. He said the assessments were thorough and he appreciated the documentation discipline. He said 3 faults in 3 months on 3 different cables with similar damage profiles was a pattern worth noting. He said he was going to flag it for the cable owners' technical committee and request a review. He said in the meantime, the repair schedule was what it was, and we should continue operating. He said in his experience, Unusual damage profiles in the deep Atlantic often turned out to have geological explanations that took time to identify. New species of boring organisms, unusual sediment compositions, previously uncharted geological features that produced cable movement. He said the deep ocean was incompletely understood, and his instinct was that we were looking at a natural phenomenon that hadn't been categorized yet. I said that was possible. I said I wanted to request ROV survey time at the next fault location, not just the standard pre-repair survey, but extended survey time to examine the cable environment on both sides of any future fault before we raised the cable. He said he would authorize it if the operational schedule permitted. He said good work. I knew what good work meant in that context. It meant the documentation was noted, and the schedule was primary, and the operational constraints were what they were. I went back to the jointing bay and looked at my photographs and thought about 60 centimeters and 62 centimeters and what came next. Fault 4 was September 2nd. I had been watching the monitoring reports every day, and when the alert came in, I was ready. Cable designation CA2, running from the Canary Islands toward the Caribbean, 4,100 meters depth, 1,400 kilometers west-northwest of the Canary Islands, the deepest fault of the 4. We were 4 days in transit. I used the transit to prepare the ROV survey protocol I wanted to run before the cable raise. Soraya and I sat in the ROV control room for 6 hours on the first night of transit and worked through the survey plan, camera positions, sonar settings, the specific documentation I wanted on the cable environment before we disturbed it. She had looked at my photographs from the 3 previous faults. She had said what Rob had said, that she had never seen that damage profile. And she had added one thing that Rob had not said, which was that the deformation was too clean. She said biological predation marks were always irregular, even in large organisms. The force was never perfectly uniform around a circumference. She said the only thing she could think of that would produce perfectly uniform circumferential compression would be a very precisely shaped, very rigid gripping structure. She said she did not know what had a gripping structure of the precise dimensions to produce a 62 centimeter section of uniform cable deformation at 4,000 meters depth. I said neither did I. She said she wanted to run the survey. We arrived on station on September 6th. The cable position was confirmed by acoustic transponder, the standard pre-repair locating method. Soraya launched the ROV at 0830 and ran the descent 4,100 meters, 58 minutes down. I was in the ROV control room with her. The cable came into the ROV's lights at 4,087 meters. Lying in its normal configuration on a flat sediment plain, no obvious external damage visible from the survey approach. I asked Soraya to run the survey protocol. Slow transit along the cable route, full lighting, cameras on all 3 positions, sonar mapping active. She ran it. For the first 20 minutes of the survey, the cable looked normal. Intact white outer sheath, no deformation visible, armor wire structure clean. Then, at 23 minutes, we found it. The fault section. It was 340 meters southwest of our initial survey position, and it was different from what I had expected, which was another section of inward deformed armor wires. The outer sheath of the cable was intact. No visible deformation. The fault indicator from the monitoring system was telling us there was a signal interruption at this position, and the cable showed no external damage. That was unusual. External damage was almost always visible in a functioning fault. The signal interruption coming from the mechanical compromise of the fiber bundle. And mechanical compromise meant external damage. I told Soraya to take the ROV in close enough for the high-resolution camera to image the cable surface at full magnification. She brought the ROV to within 40 centimeters of the cable. I looked at the high-resolution feed, and I saw something that I sat with for a long time before I said anything to Soraya or to anyone. The cable surface at the fault location was covered in a thin, even, continuous coating, not sediment. Sediment on cable surfaces was irregular, patchy, thicker in depressions, and lighter on exposed surfaces. This was uniform and smooth, and it had a slight translucency in the ROV's lights, a pale quality that was almost iridescent when Soraya adjusted the light angle. It covered an approximately 70-centimeter section of the cable's circumference completely. A coating. Something had coated the cable. I asked Soraya to take a sample. She used the ROV's manipulator arm to scrape a small amount of the coating material into the sample container we had loaded for exactly this eventuality. Then I asked her to hold position and widen the survey area, running the ROV along the cable in both directions from the coated section, out to 200 meters in each direction. She ran the survey. At 60 meters southwest of the coated section, she found a second coated section, shorter, 30 centimeters. At 110 meters northeast, she found a third, 25 centimeters. 3 coated sections. The longest at the fault location, 2 smaller ones on either side of it, decreasing in length as they moved away from the fault point. I had Soraya photograph all 3 from multiple angles. Then I sat back in my chair and looked at the survey data and thought about what I was seeing. The fault was not in the cable. The fault was in the coating. Something had applied a coating to the cable exterior that was affecting the signal in the fiber bundle inside, not through mechanical deformation, through something else. Electromagnetic interference, thermal effect, some property of the coating material that was interrupting the optical signal through the intact cable sheath. And the coating had been applied in 3 sections, 1 large and 2 smaller, with a spatial distribution around the fault point that was organized, not random. The largest section at the failure point, smaller sections at decreasing distances on either side, a pattern of application that implied a knowledge of where the cable signal was concentrated or where the interruption would be most effective. I asked Soraya to run the extended survey outward, another 100 meters in each direction. She found 4 more coated sections, 2 on each side, each one smaller than the last, each one further from the fault point. The coating fading from the 70-centimeter central section through 30 and 25 and then 12 and 8 centimeters at the outer margins. 7 coated sections in total, organized symmetrically around the fault point with decreasing coating mass at increasing distances. Something had applied a graduated coating to this cable in a pattern with the specific structure of something that understood how the cable worked. I told Soraya to hold position, and I went to find Captain Blake. Blake came to the ROV control room and looked at the survey footage and the photographs. He looked at the coating sections in sequence. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked if I thought the coating was biological. I said the sample was in the container and I did not know yet. I said the surface appearance was consistent with biological secretion. He asked if I thought the coating had been applied intentionally. I said the symmetrical distribution around the fault point and the graduated mass pattern were inconsistent with random biological growth or deposition. Biological growth on cable surfaces was patchy and opportunistic. This was organized. He said organized was a significant word. I said yes. He said he was going to make a logbook entry, and he wanted the full ROV survey footage archived before we raised the cable. I said Soraya had already done it. He went back to the bridge, and I went back to the ROV controls and asked Soraya to do one more thing. I asked her to run the cameras at maximum sensitivity, looking for any biological presence in the cable environment, above and around and below the cable, out to the limits of the ROV's light range. She ran the cameras for 20 minutes. The sediment around the cable was empty. No biological presence visible. Whatever had applied the coating was not there while the ROV was present. I noted that. I noted the implication of it. I raised the cable and examined the coated sections in the jointing bay. The coating was a substance I could not identify from visual examination. It was smooth and slightly flexible, and it adhered to the cable sheath with enough tenacity that removal required physical scraping. It did not smell of anything I recognized. Under the hand lens, it had a faint structure, not crystalline, something more like a very fine fibrous weave, almost as if it had been secreted and then laid down in layers. The sample from the ROV container went to the ship's laboratory, and I ran the basic tests I had available: pH, viscosity, response to heat, microscopic appearance. The substance was organic. It had a protein component. I could confirm that much with the equipment I had. The microscopic appearance showed a cellular structure, very small cells, very regular, arranged in a pattern that was more organized than most biological secretion structures I had seen in my experience of deep-sea biological fouling on cable surfaces. I packaged the sample for shipment to a laboratory in the UK that did biological analysis for the cable industry. Organisms that fouled cables, organisms that damaged cables, organisms that were found in cable environments. I sent it with a detailed note explaining the context. I did not repair the cable by removing the coating alone, because the coating had not physically damaged the cable sheath, and the signal interruption had another cause I had not yet identified. I ran tests and found a microfracture in the inner fiber bundle at the primary coating location, the kind of fracture that under different circumstances I would have attributed to compression damage. The compression had been applied from the outside. The coating was not the cause of the fracture. Something had gripped the cable at this location, producing the same damage profile as the 3 previous faults, and then had coated the damaged section afterward. I repaired the cable, spliced the fractured fiber bundle section, returned the cable to the bottom. I filed the damage report, and for the first time in 4 faults, I did not put unknown in the probable cause field. I put biological, origin unknown. Cullen called me within the hour. He said biological was a different category than mechanical. It had different implications for the cable owner's warranty and insurance coverage. He said he needed more information before he could approve that categorization. I told him I had a biological sample in transit to the UK laboratory, and I would have results within 3 weeks. He said he wanted the sample results before the categorization was finalized. He said in the meantime, he was going to keep the fault listed as mechanical unknown. I said I understood. I sent the laboratory a follow-up note asking them to expedite the analysis. The laboratory results came back on September 28th. I read the report on my laptop in my cabin on the Meridian, which was on station for a fault on a different cable in a different location, one of the normal faults, mechanical damage, trawl net, identifiable and straightforward. I read the laboratory report twice before I went to find Rob. The substance was biological. That was confirmed. It was a secretion, a complex organic compound with a protein matrix and a polysaccharide component and trace mineral inclusions that the laboratory listed individually: iron, magnesium, calcium, silicon, zinc, several others in small concentrations. The cellular structure was consistent with a glandular secretion from a multicellular organism of significant size. The laboratory estimated based on the secretion composition and structure that the organism producing it was likely large. The secretion showing characteristics of a thermal regulation compound of the type produced by organisms that needed to manage heat exchange in cold environments. The laboratory had run a database comparison against all known deep-sea biological secretion compounds. No match. They had run it against all known biological fouling compounds found on subsea cables in the Atlantic. No match. They had run it against the broader marine biology secretion database, maintained by a research institution they contracted with. No match. The covering note from the laboratory's senior analyst said the compound was unlike anything in their reference database, and she was recommending that a sample be sent to a marine biology research institution for specialist analysis. She noted that the cellular structure was highly organized and consistent with a secretion produced by an organism with significant physiological complexity. She said in her 20 years of analyzing deep-sea biological samples, she had not seen a compound with this combination of characteristics. I showed the report to Rob. He read it in silence. Then he said, "It's been on 4 cables." I said, "At minimum 4. I said the first 3 faults I had not had the benefit of the pre-raise ROV survey, and I had not known to look for the coding. I said the first 3 might also have had coatings that were removed when the cable was raised through the water column. The coating material might not have survived the ascent or the pressure change, and I had simply not found it in the jointing bay examination because it had dissolved or detached." Rob said that was possible. He said it was also possible that the first 3 faults were grip damage without coating, and the 4th was grip damage with coating, and that meant the behavior was changing. I said that was the other possibility. He said if the behavior was changing, it was changing in one direction, and that direction was more. I said yes. He said he thought I should call Cullen before I showed this to the captain. I asked why. He said because Cullen had kept the 4th fault as mechanical unknown, and if I went to Blake before Cullen, Blake would act on it before Cullen had a chance to frame the institutional response. And he thought it was better for everyone, including me, if Cullen understood what was coming before it arrived. I said I thought that was politically correct and scientifically backwards. He said yes, and in his experience, political correctness and scientific correctness rarely arrived at the same destination at the same time, and the question was which one you needed to get where you were going. I thought about that. I called Cullen. He received the laboratory report by email while I had him on the phone. He read it while we spoke. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he wanted to arrange a call with the cable owners' technical committee, the operations director for the North Atlantic, and the laboratory analyst. He said he wanted that call within the week. He said in the meantime, I should not share the report outside the vessel command. He said he understood the scientific implications, and he wanted to address them through the appropriate channels. I said I understood. I went to Blake and told him what Cullen had said, and gave him the laboratory report anyway, because Blake's logbook was the most reliable record I had, and I needed it to contain everything. And because I had worked on this vessel for 3 years, and I trusted Blake's judgment above Cullen's in matters involving the safety of the crew and the vessel, and because some information had an obligation to be shared regardless of what appropriate channels preferred. The call with the technical committee was on October 4th. 6 people on the line: Cullen, the North Atlantic Operations Director, 2 engineers from the cable owner's technical team and the laboratory analyst, and me. The technical engineers asked questions about the damage profiles for 40 minutes. Good questions, specific questions, the kind that told me they had read my documentation carefully. The laboratory analyst walked through her findings. She was precise and measured, and she said at the end of her presentation that in her professional opinion, the compound was produced by an organism of significant size, significant physiological complexity, and an apparent behavioral relationship with the cables that was unlike anything documented in the marine biology literature. She said the application pattern, the organized distribution around the fault point with graduated mass at increasing distances, was the most unusual aspect of the finding and the most difficult to explain through any passive biological process. She said passive biological fouling did not organize itself by distance from a structural feature. She said the pattern implied active application. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then, the North Atlantic Operations Director, a man named Philip Steed, who I had spoken to twice in 3 years and who had a reputation for direct questions, asked her directly what she thought was applying the compound. She said she did not know. She said the compound characteristics were consistent with a large deep-sea organism, possibly a new species given the database non-match, and the behavioral evidence suggested the organism had a significant capacity for organized, purposeful action. Steed asked me how many cables I thought had been affected. I told him I had confirmed 4 faults with the same damage profile going back to June, and I had not had pre-raise ROV survey capability for the first 3. I told him I had reviewed the fault records for the North Atlantic cables going back 2 years, and I had found 6 additional faults logged as mechanical unknown that had measurement data consistent with the same damage profile. 10 faults in total that might be attributable to the same source, spread across different cables and different positions in the North Atlantic over a period of approximately 2 years. Steed asked why nobody had identified the pattern earlier. I said the faults were on different cables logged by different repair teams in different months, and nobody had reviewed them as a sequence. He asked if I had run that analysis myself. I said yes. I said the damage profile was distinctive enough that once I had my own documentation from the TN4 fault, I was able to identify it in retrospect in the historical records. He said that was good work. Cullen said the key question was what action the committee recommended going forward. Steed said he wanted a full pre-raise ROV survey on every North Atlantic fault until further notice, with biological sampling and extended area survey. He said he wanted the laboratory analysis expedited on any future samples. He said he was going to flag the situation for the cable owners, insurers, and legal team. He said there would be a further call in 2 weeks. The call ended. Cullen called me immediately after and said I should know that the insurer flagging was a significant step, and it would generate attention from parts of the organization that would want answers I might not be able to provide. He said my documentation was excellent and would protect me, but I should be prepared for the fact that excellent documentation of an unknown phenomenon generated as many questions as it answered. I said I understood. I went back to my cabin and thought about Steed's question. Why nobody had identified the pattern earlier? I thought about the 6 historical faults that matched the profile, spread across 2 years, logged by different teams, filed under mechanical unknown, never compared. I thought about what that meant. An organism of significant size, significant physiological complexity, active and purposeful, had been damaging North Atlantic cables for at least 2 years, possibly longer, possibly much longer, and nobody had identified it because nobody had been looking at the full picture. The deep ocean floor was not monitored continuously. It was visited briefly and infrequently by ROVs conducting repair operations. Each visit isolated, each team seeing only what was immediately in front of them. The damaged section, the repair task, the return to surface. The space between visits was dark and unobserved and immense. Whatever was down there had the entire ocean floor and the entire time between visits to do whatever it did. And what it had been doing for as long as we had record of was damaging cables, not randomly, not opportunistically, in a specific, organized, purposeful way that left a signature I had been able to identify, but that nobody before me had been looking for. The 5th fault was on October 19th, cable TA3, 3,900 meters depth, 600 kilometers south of Iceland. Soraya and I ran the full pre-raise ROV survey before the cable was touched. We had upgraded the ROV's camera system between faults. Better low light sensitivity, wider field of view on the starboard side camera. Soraya descended at 700 and found the cable at 855. We ran the survey for 2 hours before I said anything about what the cameras were showing us. I want to describe what we found in the survey because it is different from what the previous 4 faults had shown. And because the difference is the thing that I have spent the most time thinking about in the months since October 19th. The cable was coated. The familiar compound, translucent, smooth, layered, covering a section of 81 centimeters at the fault point, longer than any previous fault. The coating extended outward in the same graduated pattern, smaller sections at increasing distances, but the survey extended outward further than any previous survey. We ran 250 meters in each direction, and at the outer margins of the survey area, at 190 meters northeast and 210 meters southwest of the fault point, we found something that was not cable coating. Soraya had the ROV at maximum light range when she found them, at the very edge of visibility. Structures, not geological, not cable components. Structures on the sediment floor adjacent to the cable route. 2 of them visible in the survey area, possibly more beyond the light range. They were difficult to describe precisely because the ROV's lights did not reach them fully, and the images were at the resolution limit of the camera system. What I could see was irregular mounded forms, varying in height from perhaps 20 centimeters to what appeared to be 60 or 70 centimeters at their tallest point, constructed from sediment but with an internal organization that sediment mounds did not naturally have, a deliberate quality, an architecture. The forms extended along the cable route, running parallel to it on both sides at a distance of approximately 3 meters. They were not continuous. There were gaps, but they were too regular in their spacing to be random, and their relationship to the cable route, parallel, consistent distance, organized spacing, was not a relationship that occurred in nature without an organizer. Soraya ran the ROV toward the nearest structure, and I told her to stop at 10 meters. I did not want to disturb it. I wanted to document it at the closest range that did not risk disrupting what we were looking at. From 10 meters, the structure was more visible, and the camera quality was adequate for what I needed to see. It was made from sediment and other material. Biological material, I thought, organic components mixed into the sediment in a way that had given it structural integrity it would not otherwise have had. And it was marked. On the face of the structure nearest the cable route, there were impressions, patterns in the surface material, regular and deliberate. I have no other word for them. They were the marks of something that had pressed its structure into the surface of what it had built and left traces in the material. I photographed everything. Soraya did a full 360 around the structure at 10 meters, capturing it from all angles. Then I asked her to move to the second structure, 200 meters northeast. It was similar in construction, similar in the surface marking pattern, same organization, same material composition as best I could tell from camera imagery. I asked her to look above the structures, above the cable route, in the full water column above. She pointed the cameras upward and ran them at maximum sensitivity. Nothing. The water above was empty dark. I asked her to run a passive acoustic sweep. The ROV had basic acoustic sensors for navigation. I wanted to know if there was any sound in the water near the structures. She ran it. Nothing above background. I asked her to take sediment samples from both structure locations and a water sample from 5 meters above each. She took the samples. We had been on the bottom for 4 hours and 20 minutes. I said we had what we needed and to begin the recovery. She began the ascent. While the ROV was ascending, I sat in the control room and looked at the footage from the structures on the monitor, and I thought about several things simultaneously. I thought about the distance between the structures and the cable fault, 190 and 210 meters. I thought about the area surrounding the cable in that corridor of ocean floor. I thought about the cable running northeast-southwest, and the structures running parallel to it on both sides. And I thought about what that spatial relationship implied about the thing that had built them. I thought about the coding applied to the cable in an organized pattern centered on the fault point. I thought about grip damage at 4 previous faults and at this fault, something that had found the cable and gripped it with enough force to fracture the fiber bundle inside. I thought about 10 faults over 2 years across multiple cables in multiple locations in the North Atlantic, all with the same profile, all on cables that ran through this region of the deep Atlantic floor. I thought about the word that had been sitting at the edge of my thinking for 4 months, and that I had not put in any report or any formal document because it was not a word that formal documents accommodated. Territory. The cables ran through something's territory, and the thing that lived in that territory knew the cables were there, knew what they were, had been interacting with them for as long as we had documentation and possibly longer, and had built structures next to them, and coded the damaged sections after gripping them, and had done all of this with an organization and consistency that left a pattern I could read the way I read any damage profile. A signature, the mark of something that knew its own work. I went to Blake when the ROV was recovered and the samples were secured. I showed him the footage of the structures. He watched it twice, both full runs. He looked at the still photographs I had taken from the monitor while Soraya was running the survey. He was quiet for several minutes. Then he said, How many cables run through this section of the Atlantic? I told him the cable route map for this section of the North Atlantic had 7 cables running within a 50-kilometer wide corridor. The corridor determined by the optimal fiber optic routing between Europe and North America that had been calculated by engineers in the 1980s. 7 cables, all in the same corridor, all running through the same stretch of deep ocean floor for hundreds of kilometers. He asked how long the cables had been there. I said the oldest cable in the corridor was installed in 1988, 36 years ago. The newest was installed in 2019. He wrote in his logbook. I watched him write. He had a way of writing logbook entries that conveyed in the movement of his pen what he was thinking, careful and deliberate when he was uncertain, rapid and tight when he was recording something he had already fully understood. He wrote this entry slowly. He finished and looked up and said, 36 years. I said yes. He said, it's been living with the cables for 36 years. I said the earliest damage profile I could find in the historical records was from 2021. But the historical records only went back to digital documentation, and the older records were paper-based and distributed across multiple companies, and I had not been able to access them systematically. He said, it's been down there longer than the cables have. I said yes. It was there when the first cable was laid, and it was there when the second was laid, and the third and the fourth, and it had been adapting to them, interacting with them, building its structures alongside them for as long as they had been there. He said, what does it want? I told him I thought that was the wrong question, or at least an incomplete one. I said the structures were the thing I kept coming back to. Not the damage, not the coding, the structures. Something had built structures parallel to the cable route at a consistent distance of 3 meters. That was not damage behavior, and it was not fouling behavior. That was something else. Blake said, it's claiming it. I said I thought that was closer. He said, it's marking the cable as part of its territory. I said yes. He closed the logbook and said he was calling Cullen. I said I thought Cullen was not the first call to make anymore. He said I was probably right, but Cullen was the channel, and the channel was what they had, and he was not going to bypass it. He made the call, and I sat in the chair across from his desk and listened and watched his face while he described what the ROV had found. And I saw the thing I had seen in Rob's face, and in Soraya's face, and in my own reflection in the monitor screen that morning. The expression of a person standing at the edge of what they had frameworks for, and looking into the space where the frameworks ended. Cullen arranged an emergency call 2 days later. Steed was on it. The technical engineers, the laboratory analyst, and this time a biologist from a university in Edinburgh who had been consulted by the cable owner's insurer and who had reviewed all the documentation before the call. Her name was Dr. Fiona McAllister. She asked me detailed questions about the structures, the dimensions, the material composition as best I could determine from camera imagery, the surface markings. She asked about the spatial relationship to the cable route, the 3-meter distance, the parallel orientation. She asked about the sample material and what analyses I had run aboard the vessel. She asked everything the way someone asked things when they already had a framework for the answers and needed the specifics to confirm it. When she had finished asking, she said she wanted to be careful about what she said because she was working from camera imagery and not from direct examination, and the samples had not yet been analyzed. She said the structures, based on what she could see in the photographs and footage, were inconsistent with any geological formation or known biological structure in the deep Atlantic environment. She said the surface markings were not something she could identify as any known biological or physical process. She said the spatial relationship to the cable, the 3-meter distance maintained along the cable route, the parallel orientation, was suggestive of a relationship between the organism or organisms and the cable infrastructure that was organized and consistent over time. She said she wanted to see the samples before she said anything further. She said the cable damage profile, the secretion compound analysis, and now the structures together represented a pattern of organism-cable interaction unlike anything in the documented record. She said the behavioral evidence across 10 faults suggested an organism or population of organisms that had been aware of and interacting with the cable network in this corridor for a significant period of time. Steed asked her what she recommended. She said she recommended that a marine biology research team be deployed with a research submersible to the cable corridor for direct observation. She said camera and sample data from repair ROVs was not sufficient to characterize what the evidence suggested was down there. She said direct observation from a crewed submersible was the only way to get the resolution of data that the situation required. Steed asked about the repair operations and whether they should continue in the area. She said she could not recommend suspending cable repair operations. The cables were critical infrastructure and faults required repair. But she recommended that all future repair operations in the corridor include maximum resolution pre-raise ROV surveys with full biological sampling, and that repair personnel be aware that the cable environment might include biological activity of an unknown type. She said personnel safety was her priority concern, and she wanted to understand more before she could assess what that concern should be based on. Cullen said he would arrange the research deployment. He said it would take time to identify a suitable vessel and research team and negotiate access. He said the repair operations would continue with the enhanced survey protocol. He said he appreciated everyone's input and would arrange a follow-up call in 2 weeks. The call ended. I sat in the officer's mess where I had taken the call and looked at the blank wall in front of me for a long time. Dr. McAllister had used several careful words and hadn't used several others. But the others were in the room whether she used them or not. The same way they had been in the room when Rob said growth and when Blake said territory, and when I had sat in the jointing bay on June 4th and looked at the first fault and felt the stillness of a person who was looking at something they could not explain. The research submersible was the right call. The research submersible would go to the cable corridor and descend, and the crew would see with human eyes what the ROV cameras had been trying to show us. They would see the structures. They would see the cable environment. They would see whatever had been building and coating and gripping in that corridor of deep Atlantic floor for 36 years and possibly longer. And then we would know. We would have a name for it and a classification and a framework, and the data would fit inside the documentation systems and the insurance forms and the damage categories and the biological databases. I thought about that. I thought about the thing that had been there before. The cables were there, that had been living in that corridor when the first cable came down, and had adapted to it and made it part of its territory, that had been working on the cables for as long as we had record and longer, that had applied a graduated coding in a pattern that implied an understanding of the cable's internal structure, that had built structures parallel to the cable route at a precise 3-meter distance, that had done all of this with an organization and consistency and patience that my 11 years of cable repair experience could not contain in any category I had. I thought about what it looked like. I had no image of it. The ROV cameras had shown me its work and its structures and the cable bearing its mark. And in 4 months of operations and 5 faults, I had not once seen the organism itself. It was never present when the ROV was operating. It knew the ROV was there, or it knew something was there that was not supposed to be there. And it was absent during the survey windows. And the survey windows were our only presence in its territory. And beyond those windows, the territory was dark and unobserved and immense, and whatever lived in it went about its work unseen. 36 years of cables on the floor of the North Atlantic, and 11 years of repair operations and ROV surveys, and I was the first person to put together what the damage profiles were telling us. Not because the evidence wasn't there, because nobody had looked at the whole picture at once, because the whole picture was spread across too many repair companies, and too many fault records, and too many years for any one person to assemble it without specifically trying to. I had specifically tried to only because the TN4 damage profile had stopped me in the jointing bay on a June morning and made me stand still long enough to ask a question I hadn't asked before. What happened before June 3rd I can only infer from the historical records I was able to access. What happened in 36 years of cables on the floor of its territory I cannot fully recover. The documentation that exists is incomplete, and the documentation that would be complete is in archives I do not have access to, and in the records of companies that have no reason to compile it, and in the institutional memory of cable repair crews who saw damage profiles on their watches and wrote mechanical unknown and moved on. I submitted my resignation from Atlantic Subsea Maintenance on November 15th. I cited personal reasons. The operations coordinator who processed the form was professional and brief. I had been in cable repair for 11 years, and I was good at it. And I did not resign because I was tired of the work or afraid of the ocean or unable to continue. I resigned because the research submersible deployment that Cullen had arranged was scheduled for the spring, and I was not going to be on it, because the North Atlantic repair schedule had continued without interruption through the fall, and I was expected to keep running faults, and I ran 3 more faults in October and November, 2 of them in the cable corridor, both with the standard damage profile, both with coating on the post-raise sections, both with structures visible at the survey margins, and I had documented them with the same precision I had brought to every fault, and I had submitted the documentation through the channels, and the channels had processed it, and the repair operations had continued. The channels were doing what they could do. They were not doing what needed to be done, which was to stop and sit with the full picture and understand what we were dealing with before we continued running repair operations in that corridor, before we continued sending ROVs into the structures and the coating and the territory of whatever was down there, before we continued doing the thing that the evidence suggested had been ongoing for 36 years without anyone understanding that it was ongoing. I resigned because I could not continue operating without that understanding, and the channels were not moving fast enough to provide it. I am in a rented apartment in Lisbon now. Soraya sends me updates when there is something to update. The research submersible deployment happened in April, 3 weeks ago. They spent 4 days at the cable corridor, running survey transects, deploying cameras, taking samples. The preliminary results are not public. I have a contact at the research institution that provided the submersible, and she has told me what she can tell me, which is limited, but which is something. She said they found the structures. She said the structures extended along the cable corridor for significantly further than the survey data from the repair ROVs had shown, that the corridor of structures was kilometers long, not meters, running parallel to the cable route for the full length of the survey transect. She said the surface markings on the structures were more extensive and more organized than the ROV imagery had indicated. She said they had not made visual contact with any organism during the 4 days of the deployment. She said the structures showed evidence of recent activity, fresh material additions, disturbance in the sediment around the base of some structures consistent with recent contact. She said whatever maintained the structures had been active in the days or weeks before the deployment. She said she could not tell me more than that because the preliminary findings were under review and the research team was preparing a formal report. I said I understood. I thanked her. I went to my window and looked out at the Tagus and thought about what it meant that whatever built those structures had been active in the days before the submersible arrived. I thought about whether it knew the submersible was coming, the way it seemed to know when the ROVs were present, and absented itself from the survey area. I thought about 36 years of cables, and 11 years of repair operations, and the first fault in June that made me stand still and ask a question. I thought about the territory, the corridor, the structure, the graduated coating, the organized damage. I thought about the thing that had been there before the cables were there, that had adapted to the cables, that had made the cables part of its world in a way that left a signature I could read only because I had looked at enough damage profiles to know what reading them meant. The research report will come out when it comes out. The channels will process it. The appropriate frameworks will be applied to whatever conclusions the research team reaches. And those frameworks will contain some of what the evidence shows and not all of it, because no framework currently built for the deep Atlantic fauna is large enough to contain all of it. I know this because I have spent 5 months assembling the full picture, and the full picture is not a picture that fits inside existing frames. The cables are still down there. The corridor is still down there. The structures are still down there. Fresh material added in the days before the submersible arrived. And the submersible left, and the submersible returned to port, and the dark came back to the corridor, the way it always comes back, the way it has always been down there, cold and complete and absolute. And in the dark, alongside the cables that carry the world's communications and financial transactions and streaming data and daily life, in the structures built along the cable route at a precise 3-meter distance, in the coded sections and the gripped sections and the marked surfaces, in 36 years of silent work that nobody named until June 3rd of last year, something lives. Something that was there before the cables and will be there after them. Something that looked at the first cable when it came down in 1988 and made a decision about it, and has been implementing that decision for 36 years with a patience and consistency and organization that I can recognize and document and attempt to describe, but cannot fully explain, because the explanation requires a framework I do not have. And the cables I have spent 11 years repairing are part of something's world that I have spent 5 months trying to understand, and have only just begun to see. The corridor is still there. The structures are still there. Every 6 months, a repair vessel will go to a fault in that corridor and lower an ROV and find the damage and raise the cable and run the repair. And somewhere in the dark around the fault location, At the edge of the ROV's light range and beyond it, the structures will be there, running parallel to the cable route at 3 meters, fresh and maintained, and whatever maintains them will be absent during the survey window and present before and after it. 36 years, possibly longer, patient and present and certain, in the way that something is certain when the territory has been its own since before the infrastructure arrived, since before the ships came with the cables and the grapnels and the ROVs and the repair schedules, and the documentation forms that did not have a category for what they were looking at. It was there first. It was there first, and it knows we are still coming back every 6 months with our lights and our cameras and our sample containers and our frameworks into its corridor, into its territory, into the dark where it lives. It has always let us come. It has always been absent when we look for it.